I'm extremely happy to stand here in front of you today. I'm going to be wearing two hats today. My name is Torbjörn Becker. I'm the director of the Stockholm Institute of Transition Economics here at the Stockholm School of Economics. I'm also the chairperson for the expert group for aid studies, EBA in Swedish. And we are together with Sida, the Swedish Development Cooperation Agency, and of course the World Bank, organizing this discussion here today. And I'm really grateful that we have this opportunity to have our distinguished guests here for this important discussion. It's going to be, as you all know, about global development and the middle income trap. Before we get going, and Mats is going to be leading us through this discussion, I just want to share with you 1 minute of where we are today. So the Stockholm School of Economics was the first business and economics school set up here in Sweden in 1909. And this was a joint venture back then between the Swedish private sector and the Swedish government. And still to this day, I would say that this is one of really the top-ranked universities in this country. Given the topic today, I also just want to mention that back in 1909, the income level of the average Swedish person here was about half of the income level of the average person growing up in the UK. So this is quite some distance behind. Today, I'm kind of happy that this school and everyone else in this society has contributed to the fact that we're actually now about 15% better off than the average citizen of the UK. I'm not going to discuss how this is related to Brexit or any other institutional developments, but I think it is fair to say, though, that the Swedish experience is really founded on this idea of education, innovation, getting all of society to contribute to a very successful, I would say, growth path that we have seen over the last 100 or so years. Not least when it comes to including everyone in work life, and of course women in particular in the Swedish history has contributed to this very impressive development. But with those few words, again, I'm really happy to see all of you here today. I know that there are other things going on outside of this window. I just think I should also introduce Mats Horsmar before we let him take over today's event as a moderator. He's the Deputy Managing Director of EBA. He has, of course, a long background in doing research and working on development issues. So I feel that we are in very safe hand with him as a moderator here today. So give Mats and our guest of honor a big hand of applause.
So, welcome to all. I have one practical issue first, mandatory. If anything unexpected should happen, there are emergency exits there, and also on that side. That will not happen, but you know it. We will discuss middle-income countries today, their economic growth and opportunities for development. This category of countries, it's a wide variety of countries. Together, some 75% of the world's population reside in these countries, and 62% of those living in poverty reside there. To become a middle-income country, you need to have an economy of at least $1135 per capita gross national income. But you remain middle income up to $13,845 per capita GNI. So a huge split there, and a split in the middle with lower middle income and upper middle income. But definitions apart, today's first presenter, Senior Vice President and Chief Economist of the World Bank, Mr. Indermit Gill, he argues that think about middle-income countries and their capacity to grow in terms of the income level levels leads us astray. We need to go beyond the numbers into development strategies to understand them. So Mr. Gill has been researching middle-income countries for quite some time, also the middle-income trap. And the theme of middle-income trap is also the theme of this year's World Development Report, which will come out later this year. The presentation of Mr. Gill will be followed by a panel discussion. I will introduce the panelists later on. There will also be a possibility for you to ask questions to the panel. You should use your phones. There's a QR code somewhere, will appear somewhere that you could find, and then put your questions on your phone. Those of you who follow us online, you can write your questions in the chat box there. So, we're very proud to have you with us, Mr. Development Gill. I look forward to listen to you and your thoughts on this theme, which is very timely for the world, but also for Sweden as an actor on the international scene. So you're most welcome. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Mats. Thank you very much. Thank you again. So it's a pleasure to be here. What a great room. And thank you very much, Torbjörn, for your remarks. That's good. Go back there. Perfect. Thank you so much. Okay. So I have a different theory about why the UK or why Sweden has done so well relative to the UK, because in 1909 there were quite a few people from the UK who were busy trying to suppress folks back in India, and I think and they got a lot. They got a lot from this. So I don't know if it was Brexit or if it was colonialism, but I like the result that we have today. Okay. So my name is Indermeet Gill, and I'm here with my colleagues from the World Bank. You will actually hear from some of them. The person you won't actually hear from is Somik Lal. He's sitting right over there. And the reason why you won't hear from him is because he actually knows the most about this subject. And that's the way we work at the World Bank. We don't let the person who knows the most talk in public settings. So he's actually the person who directed the world, or who is directing the World Development Report. This World Development Report has not yet been published. It has just been sent to our board of directors, and it will be published in about a month or so. Right? So you are actually getting a preview of the report. The plan for the day today is to discuss what has become known as the middle income trap, as you can see from those slides there, and what countries like India and countries like China and others and Brazil and so on can do to avoid it, right? So I'll talk about this for about 20 minutes and just take you through these slides very, very quickly, okay? And we can answer your questions whenever. Now, so what are the countries that we are talking about? So these are these are countries that are called middle-income economies, and that's how they're classified by the World Bank, right? These are countries that have per capita incomes of between $1,200 and about $14,000, $13,800 or something like that. And there are about 108 countries like this, okay? They have the largest part of the world's population now. They don't have the largest part of the world's gross domestic product. It's still about a third or so. But they are the ones whose share is rising very, very fast, not just because of China, but also because of other countries and so on. As for you to understand what kind of countries we are talking about, So lower middle income countries are those that have incomes between about 1,200 and about 5,000. And these are countries like India and Vietnam and Pakistan and so on. And the upper middle income countries are those like China and Brazil and Indonesia too now. And these countries have incomes between about $5,000 and about $14,000, right? And the big problems that these countries face is that they have considerably more difficulty going from $100 per capita to about $1,000 per capita than they do to get from 1,000 to 10,000, even though in each case it is about 10 times. So it takes much longer for them to go from 100 to 1,000 than it does to go from 1,000 to 10,000. Yeah? So these countries appear to get stuck in the middle, right? And so back in 2007 or so, I had just moved from Latin America to East Asia, and my boss at the time, his name is Homi Karas, who had also moved from Latin America to East Asia. So we were asked by countries like Malaysia, like Indonesia and others, that they were very worried that their future would look not like that of Taiwan or South Korea or Singapore or Hong Kong, but that their future might look a lot more like Brazil and Mexico and Argentina and Chile and so on. So they said that from their studies and so on, they're finding that their structures are beginning to look a lot more like Brazil and so on. And why was that something that scared them? It was because Brazil actually had also grown very, very quickly in the 1950s, in the 1960s, and the 1970s. It had gotten to per capita income levels of around $3,000, $4,000, $5,000, and then it had just stayed there. Okay, so that was the case. That was the case for Latin America, and in between, they had tried to do things, and rather than going forward, they had actually gone backwards. It was called the lost decade of the 1990s, and so on. And so they said, okay, and so we wrote this really good book. So the book is called the book was called An East Asian Renaissance, and we had lots of nice work in it and so on. But the thing that somewhere along the way we used the word middle income trap, and nobody remembers anything else about the book except that term, the middle income trap. Okay, and this term basically has stuck because essentially the policymakers seem to actually be the biggest users of this term. And so if you search for this term on Google now, for example, you find everybody using it. So we now, but until last year, we weren't actually any clearer about what a country should be doing to avoid getting bogged down in middle income. So one of the things that we did was that we said, okay, why don't we take a serious look at it? And so that's what Shomik and his team did over the last year. And some of the slides that I will show you sort of give you a flavor of what they're finding, right? Okay. So let me pop up. I should go this way. No. Is it this way? There, right? Is that good? Okay. So all World Bank reports tend to have three parts. Okay. And the first part tends to be about the facts. The second part tends to be about some theory or conceptual framework. And then the third part has to do about policies, right? And so this World Development Report is essentially the same, okay? And the first part, which is the facts part, actually shows the first chapter of this report actually talks about the first chapter documents how middle-income countries, how growth in middle-income countries slows as they go through this range that I just told you about, the 1,200 to about 12,000. The second part actually says, even though that is pretty depressing for these countries, especially because a large number of people who actually live in these countries now, it looks like their future is going to be even tougher. Okay? And the future is going to be even tougher because they're facing that if you compare what the global environment looks like for these countries with what the global environment looked like for countries that were middle income back in 2000, in the year 2000, it's actually become, things have become tougher, not easier for them, right? The third thing, of course, is that what we also say here is that if you look at a country that has a per capita income of $1,200, and if you compare it to a country that has a per capita income of 12,000, these countries are very different in structure. It's not the case that the country that has $12,000 per capita is just a bigger version of a country that has 1,200, right? So along the way, they actually have to change their structures. And there's something very difficult to do when you try to change the structures. So some of these countries have actually managed to grow their incomes very quickly because they have a lot of oil or they have a lot of gas, but they have not changed their structures enough. So as a result, they often go backwards. Right? So that's the first part. The second part of the report, what we do is that we borrow the ideas from Schumpeterian creative destruction, right? And what we end up doing is we end up taking a look at the forces that lead to greater creation, forces that are those that actually fight change in the sense that they're the forces of preservation. And then the third part is, of course, we also look at issues related to the forces of destruction. Now, in general, if I had to summarize this part, I would sort of say that one is that we find that Schumpeterian theory of creative destruction has evolved a lot since Joseph Schumpeter. Okay, and what we do is that we look at three vintages of this thinking. The first one is that of Joseph Schumpeter himself. Then the second one is the line of work that was pioneered by Philippe Aghion and Peter Howitt back in the early 90s. And then we also look at what Schumpeterian growth theory looks like now, right? And here we use the work of Ufuk Aysigit and his co-authors, who actually also were quite closely involved in the writing of this report, right? He was actually a lead academic advisor. So the way to best summarize this is that part of the reason why these countries get stuck is that these forces of creation, preservation, and destruction are very lopsided. So, for example, the forces of preservation are very strong. The forces of destruction are relatively weak. And the forces of creation can be okay, or they can be weak. So you have, imagine these three balls, right? Creation, preservation, and destruction. And if these balls are of very, very different sizes, it becomes a very lopsided kind of a growth when you try to sort of get this moving. Okay? And what this basically, what part two shows is that if you make these forces more balanced, you end up going faster. Okay? And the countries that have managed to escape the middle income trap have actually done that rather well. And then finally, the third part is how do you actually change these things? So the third part is the policy part. And it's called making miracles because actually that term is borrowed from a paper by Bob Lucas, who actually had a paper called Making a Miracle. And I think it was about South Korea's story. And if South Korea was a miracle, for some of the countries today, to do what South Korea did back then would be an even bigger miracle, because the global environment is no longer that benign as compared to what it was for South Korea. Okay? And what we sort of say is that these countries have to do three very, very difficult things. The first one is to discipline incumbency. I'll explain that in a minute. The second one is to reward merit. And then the third one is to capitalize on crises. So if you notice, what you'll see in this World Development Report is that we actually take up issues that are economic. We take up issues that have to do with social issues, essentially society, and then we take up issues that are much more political, right? And if you go back to Schumpeter's original work, you actually realize that he actually did talk about capitalism, socialism, and democracy. So all three of those things. Okay, so that's the summary of the thing. So here was a chart that actually Mats actually spoke about this a little bit. I just thought I would show you these numbers again. And what you sort of see is low-income countries, there are now about 30 of them. These countries have about less than 10% of the world's population, and they actually don't have much in the way of CO2 emissions. They have more than a third of the extreme poor of the world. They actually have they have very little of the share of world economic output. The only good thing about this is that there are many countries that there used to be many more low-income countries than there are now. Most of them have actually moved into the next two categories, which is lower middle and then upper middle. And so roughly speaking, if you add up these two countries, these two parts, there are about 108 countries, roughly split evenly, about 50 and 50. Okay? And if you look at lower middle income countries like India, you see that their population shares are about 40% of the world. Their GDP shares are less than 10%. And they still have a large number of people who live in extreme poverty. And then if you look at the CO2 emissions, they're actually relatively small given the size of the population, but they're growing very rapidly. And then if you look at upper middle income countries, these are countries like China and so on, and Brazil, and right. And these countries have a population of about a third, GDP of about also a third, and then you have extreme poverty almost gone, and then but you have 50% of the world's emissions actually come. All right, and rich countries like Sweden, have about a seventh of the world's population, but they have about more than half the world's output, nearly 2/3 of the world's output. Right. Okay. Now, if you speak to countries who are lower middle income countries or upper middle income countries, and you ask them what do they aspire to, right? They have no doubt about what they aspire to. The only doubts are those of people in places like the World Bank and so on, who say, well, maybe these countries cannot afford to replicate the past, right? So they have to come up with a different way and so on. For them, actually, what they want, they aspire to higher living standards. They aspire to the living standards of countries like Chile, countries like Poland, countries like South Korea. They aspire to the same. So actually, Deng Xiaoping, when he was asked, but isn't aspiring to high incomes, isn't this against socialism, right? And he said, no, to get rich is glorious. Everybody should be rich, right? So that's what they want to do. And if you look at their plans actually have some form of getting out of middle income to high income levels. Okay? So, for example, in the case of China, you have the 14th five-year plan, the median income that they would like to reach the median income levels of developed countries, the median, not the higher end and so on, by greatly expanding the middle class and so on, right? India has the same. India has a view called that by the time that India's independence, by the time that India reaches 100 years of independence, it would be a developed nation and so on. Vietnam, the same, South Africa, you name it, all of these. These are all nice intentions, but they actually run into one major problem. And the major problem is that if you look at their performance, the performance of middle-income countries, there you don't see much catch-up here. In fact, if you look at middle-income countries excluding China, there is actually a steady decline in the share of these countries when you compare it to the per capita income of the United States. Okay, and that has stagnated since 1970. So but basically, you see that if you exclude China, it has gone from about 20%, like about a fifth of US GDP, all the way down to about actually even less, about a seventh. And then if you include China, you actually see something better, where you see that share goes from about 10% to about 15, 16% or so, right? So these countries have not done particularly well. This chart actually surprised me when Shomik showed it to me. And I realized why it was the case, because when I left the World Bank in 2016, I thought I had worked in development during the time that these were the golden years of development. And in many ways they were, because it looked, if you saw the share of people who were living in extreme poverty, it had fallen from about 60% down to about 6%. It was fantastic. But then when you think about that again, you realize it's because we actually set a very low bar there. It was just people who had more than $2 of consumption per day. It's a very, very low bar. When you raise that bar just a little bit more and say, should you also sort of see convergence in their income levels to the world's frontier, right? As soon as you see that, you actually see this, okay? So that feeling that I had that we had done a great job in terms of development during the time that I worked in development, which was from around the mid 80s to about 2016, actually it turns out that we had not done particularly well when you just raise the standard a little bit. Okay. Now, then what we do is because this is a World Bank report, and because we like to argue a lot at the World Bank, and so essentially we had a lot of arguments about, is there a middle income trap or not? Is there a middle income trap or not? And at the end of it, so we spent quite a bit of time on this one, in the sense of saying, is there a systematic slowdown as countries reach these middle income levels? And what this chart actually tells you is that it does, roughly at around levels that are about 11% of US GDP in per capita dollar terms. But if you sort of look at purchasing power parity adjusted, it's about 20% or so. But you do sort of see this. You also see some really nice thing. You see that for countries that actually that have institutions that provide greater economic freedoms and so on, you actually find that they actually do much better, in the sense that they don't hit this slowdown nearly as quickly as countries that have less economic freedom. Okay. So we spent quite a bit of time on this one, and you'll see lots of charts in the thing. When we talked to the policymakers, they said something that actually Norman and his co-authors had actually written a short note once, that for policymakers, this is not a bad goal to actually try to sort of rally around and say, let's try to sort of reach this thing. So they said, well, we're not really interested in whether or not you can rigorously prove that there is this thing. We kind of take it for granted that you can get stuck at these things, because 108 countries appear to be stuck and so on. But then when you look at the countries, oh shoot, where is this one? Yeah. So here was this other thing that I saw when we actually look at the literature. You say, well, it doesn't look that bad, right? Because you have, if you look at countries and look at their per capita income in 1990 and compare that to their per capita income in 2021, So there's this group of countries, about 34 of them, that have actually become high income. Okay? So in 34 years, you have 34 countries graduating to high income. So that's not bad at all, one country a year. That's pretty good. The trouble is that when you look at these countries more closely, you realize two or three things about them. The first one, of course, is that they tend to be in Europe. So they tend to be part of the European Union, usually. Okay? And there's nothing wrong with that, because we have actually said in another report, we've said that the European Union is a great invention. In fact, we called it the convergence machine. It actually does a very good job of taking countries and bringing them up to high income levels. Okay? And there are some other countries too, of course. There, you see at the top of this chart, you see Korea there, and then you see a few other countries here too, including countries that have a lot of oil, for example, or that are very small island states like Trinidad and Tobago and those kind of things. But the point really is that if you add up all of these countries, you don't get to 250 million. Okay? So it's like adding up all of this stuff is kind of like one country the size of Brazil or the size of Pakistan became high income economy. Okay? So that's the sum total of the achievement that you sort of see over here. Bigger countries have had trouble trying to get to things. And if you look at the struggles of China right now and so on, you actually realize why it's so difficult for a country China size or India size and so on to actually get to this, right? And partly it is because of this problem. Partly it is because of the fact that you now have economic fragmentation as a big threat. The other part you see is that these countries, many of them have very high levels of debt. And this is not unrelated to the fact that these countries are aging very, very rapidly. So many of these countries, unlike the early high income economies, they don't get to high income before they become old. That's the reason why we sort of look at economies like Turkey, like Indonesia, and like India, and so on. These are countries that people are more optimistic about because they have relatively younger populations. Okay. All right. So then you say, okay, what is it that these countries do wrong? Why is it that there are these 108 countries that seem to be stuck and they're having such a hard time? Now, things are going to get harder for them. Things are going to get harder for them because of the global environment becoming more restrictive, in a sense that they are growing into smaller spaces when it comes to trade, smaller spaces when it comes to climate change and the use of energy. Because if you look at many of the countries that did get to high income early, they've had one thing that low energy prices. If you look at the period during which these countries became high income economies, these are period of abnormally low energy prices, like the price of oil, the price of natural gas, and so on. These countries cannot afford to do that because now actually have to grow into more and more. But there are things that these countries do to themselves that they actually end up reducing their chances to actually get to high income. And one of the things that they end up doing is when you look at an economy that is a low income economy, for that to become a middle income economy, basically what you need are investment accelerations. You need to accumulate more capital. Everybody works. And that's a relatively simple strategy, and countries that engineer these investment accumulations. So if you look at the middle income countries today and compare it with the low income countries today, we actually find that if you define investment accelerations as a certain thing, what you see is that they have engineered twice as many investment accelerations as the countries that are still poor. Okay. All right. So that's fine. So because this is a relatively simple strategy, you actually see that lots of countries get out of low income. The problem then is that many of them start to make a mistake, because what you have to do is you can either try to stick with this, you can try to stick with an investment-led strategy, but it will pay lower and lower returns. Or what you do, and what we talk is that you move to a somewhat more complex strategy, and that one is called investment plus infusion, what we call infusion, which is borrow technologies from abroad. Am I taking too long? Yes? I'll give me 5 minutes, I'll finish. Three. Okay. And then the third thing, of course, is that what you sort of see is that once you get beyond that, you actually, then it becomes, as you get closer and closer to the world frontier, you actually need to do more. So it's not enough to just do investment. It's not enough to just do infusion, but you also have to now start to change your thing. And then if you look at the countries that have been successful, and there are three reasonable sized countries that have been successful, you start to sort of look at them, and there are lots of stories in the report that actually show these countries actually did do exactly what I just said you ought to do, which is you move from a 1I strategy to a 2I strategy to a 3I strategy in different ways. In the case of Korea, in the case of Poland and Chile. You have stories like this in the case of Korea, where you have the folks on the left over there are people who these are people who work for Samsung, and they had gone to NEC to try to get how to sort of make TVs and so on. And then what you sort of see over here is that this was not an accident. This was a matter of strategy, because what Korea did was actually they actually subsidized what is called infusion, in the sense they actually subsidized firms going abroad, bringing in new technologies and infusing them into the economy. And then once you started to get pushback from the Japanese and others, you actually sort of see is that around the time late 1980s, early 2000s, early thing, you actually sort of see that they switch from infusion subsidies to innovation subsidies. Okay? Again, because Mats is breathing down my neck, I won't be able to. I won't be able to tell you now. All this cool stuff, right? So how do you do this? And I'll just end with this, and then we can actually take up some of this stuff again. So, when we look at Schumpeterian creative destruction, the original view of Schumpeter was this one over here, which is that incumbents collude to keep entrants out. And one of the things that we find is that this view actually fits the view of the energy transition pretty well. So in middle-income countries, you find the incumbents tend to be state-owned enterprises, and they tend to be very vested in fossil fuels and so on. And then you have the smaller private sector entrants and so on, who are actually doing a lot more on the renewables, on greener technologies and so on, and they're being kept out. So this view of Schumpeter actually fits the energy part of the work that we do very well. Then if you go down further and look at Aghion and Howitt's view, Aghion and Howitt's view is that it's not as if incumbents are colluding, it's just that they're bigger, okay? And they tend to have technologies that are still profitable. And when an entrant tries to come in, what they do is that they bring in new technologies. What distinguishes Aghion and Howitt is that only new entrants bring new ideas. Okay? And this fits pretty well what you see in the social dimension, the elites versus the people who are trying to sort of take up some of the things. Men, right, who tend to be the elite, right? Rich men especially. And then you find, you don't always find that rich men collude with each other, but they do end up keeping the entrants out, and the entrants tend to be women, they tend to be minorities and so on. One more thing and I'm done. It's 3 minutes, okay? And by the way, there are huge payoffs. And what that chart on the right shows is that if there had not been anti-discrimination legislation in the United States, you would have still had per capita income growth. You would have had GDP going from about 100 to 160. But with that anti-discrimination legislation, you see it's actually gone up to 220. Massive. Finally, last one is that when it comes to the newest view of Schumpeterian creative destruction is actually the new ideas come not just from new entrants, they also come from incumbents. So the implication of all of this stuff is that we shouldn't be fixated on firm size. We should be looking at the value added. The second one is we should not be fixated on income inequality, because what we are really talking about is a more dynamic process by which you actually have a much better allocation of talent to task. So you should be worried much more about socioeconomic mobility. Okay. And we should not actually be focused so much on the sources of energy. I can explain this afterwards. We should be looking much more at the emissions intensity of GDP. The main difference being that the main difference between middle income economies and the main difference between them and high income economies is that they are less efficient. They are less efficient in terms of how they use capital, how they use labor, their talents, and how they use energy. And so the idea over here is that they have to become more efficient. And here's one way to do it. Policymakers tend to focus on the wrong things. They tend to focus on superficial indicators. These indicators at the bottom are much more reflective of the structures of the economy. And remember, that was an important part of what happens. So finally, last one is that we end up with these three rules where we say the way to get those three balls to actually balance, right? These from here to here are these three rules. The first one is you have to discipline incumbents. You don't have to vilify them, or you don't have to sort of favor the entrants and so on, because there's some entrants whom you should favor, there are other entrants you shouldn't. There's some incumbents you should favor, there are others you shouldn't. The second one is, like we said, you have to reward merit, in the sense this is the best way to allocate talent to task. And then finally is that you have to use crises, because this is the time when the forces of preservation are the weakest. And so when you look at so if you combine economics and social issues as well as energy issues, these are the three rules that come out of it. I'm sorry I took too long.
Thank you. May I offer a seat up on the stage while I introduce the panelists?
Sure thing.
Thank you so much, Dermot. We have a panel with Elina Cheia, Chief Economist of the Swedish International Development Corporation Agency, Sida. Welcome, Elina. Norman Loaiza, Director of the Global Indicators Group and Director also for the Women Business Law report that came out recently from the World Bank. We have Torbjörn Becker, whom you already know as the Director of Stockholm Institute of Transition Economies and Chair of EBA. Please. And Haishan Fu, Chief Statistician and Director of the Development Data Group of the World Bank. So I'll have you seated here, take some water if you need, and make yourself at home. Yeah. You could sit there. No, I will be standing.
Okay.
Moving around, stressing everyone so that they don't talk too long.
You are very good at that.
Yeah. It's my main talent. But I'll start with you, Elina. I think we can agree that the main purpose of discussing growth in these countries is to enable for them to increase the welfare for their citizens. And improving living conditions for people living in poverty is the objective of the Swedish Development Corporation. Do you see any role of development cooperation in relation to those challenges and that specter that Dermot brought up? How could Sida or Sweden help such countries grow? And how do you see the links between economic growth and poverty reduction playing out in different categories of countries? A host of questions just to say that you can talk for a bit.
Well, thank you very much. Well, economic growth is poverty reduction's best friend. So these trends go hand in hand. And I guess everything is relative. Intermediate was worried about the middle-income countries not catching up with high-income countries. The fact still remains that the growth in low and middle-income countries has created pathways for hundreds of millions of people to escape extreme poverty. So I think that is something to be celebrated. And during that transition of rapid poverty reduction, also many countries moved from low-income countries to middle-income countries. And today, the majority of Sida's partner countries are, in fact, middle-income countries. So this is a group of countries that we work with very closely. But I do recognize that the job is not done yet. We do have challenges ahead, and the declining growth rates in middle-income countries is a concern also from the poverty reduction perspective. But to find an appropriate role for a development actor like Sida, I think it's important to pay attention to the enormous heterogeneity that we have been talking about here today. Many people, when I talk to them about middle-income countries, they think about the Brazils and Argentinas of the world. These are higher middle-income countries, whereas when I talk about middle-income countries, we usually work with Tanzania and Uganda, who have recently graduated from low-income to lower middle-income countries. And if we talk about people living in poverty, 9 out of 10 people who live in poverty live in low or lower middle-income countries. Very few people in upper middle-income countries are living in extreme poverty. And so also our approaches to how we deal with the lower middle-income countries and upper middle-income countries as a development agency must differ. And how we used to think about it in the lower middle-income countries that still carry many of the characteristics of low-income countries, the focus is mainly to get the growth going. Development cooperation can have a very direct role in building the institutions that were just discussed here, to making sure that there is investment in infrastructure, building human capital, and setting the table for growth to happen, and providing opportunities, economic opportunities for people living in poverty and everybody in these contexts. Whereas in the upper middle income category, the focus is more on the quality of growth, in particular in the inclusion and sustainability. It's rarely the case that in these countries there are no economic opportunities, just they are very unequally distributed. If I may take Guatemala as an example, in Guatemala City, the living standards of many people are at par with high-income countries, whereas a couple of miles from the city center in the rural countryside where we have indigenous communities, especially among women, the living standards is more comparable to low-income countries. So the role of development cooperation is to make sure that we tackle these pockets of poverty and make sure everybody is on board of the transition. The creative destruction that we were discussing, it's not painless. And ensuring that there is social security systems that can capture people so that they can be part of the change rather than fall into extreme poverty is a big part of the story. And I was also talking about the sustainability aspect. I think that is a key for working with middle-income countries. These countries hold the future of our planet in their hands, and offering other alternatives than the brown industrialization that we ourselves benefited from in their journey towards prosperity is part of what development players can come with in this context. We can introduce more new technologies. We do catalyze a lot of capital to green investment and have a more catalytic role in that. So in conclusion, yes, economic growth has a huge part to play in poverty reduction. We just need to make sure that it is inclusive and sustainable. And there, I think the poverty-focused development actors have a role to play.
But many of today's middle-income countries are at a stage economically where OECD countries were when they introduced wide social protection programs. So maybe should they receive aid? Couldn't they take care of it themselves?
Both. I think the role of aid diminishes as the resources of the country increase, but the social protection coverage is very I wouldn't say the word I'm looking for is minimal in many of these contexts. I think I believe it's about 70% of the African population that is covered by any type of social protection at the moment, and it's not adequate. So aid will never be the main source of funding for that. We do need to make sure that these economies grow and have a sustainable funding base to have those type of systems. So we can build the systems, we can assist with the funding, but I think it's a bigger development process that we need.
Yeah, with insight to social issues, etc. Norman, I'd like to continue with you. We've heard from Endurement about this trap, and we saw that it's really a trap. We found it. But in your view, to escape this trap, who should take the lead? Should it be the private sector, the companies, or should it be the governments taking the lead, first steps, and sort of leading?
Well, first of all, good afternoon, everyone. It's a real pleasure for me to be here in this prestigious institution. So who should take the lead? The short answer is that both. But the long answer is that each of them should have a different role. And let me elaborate on that. The private sector, as Lina has well said, is the engine of growth. It's the one that brings about ingenuity, creativity, effort. We see it in developing countries. It employs 90% of people. It invests 75%, and it provides 80% of revenues for the state. When I was listening to Intermit, I was thinking about the private sector, that it is the one that actually does the investment, the fusion, and the innovation that is critical. It is the one that also undergoes this process of creative destruction that we can talk about in a minute. But without the government, the private sector would not be able to work in this way. So the role of the government is in the form of enabling this economic environment. And it does it by providing basic services like macroeconomic stability, like infrastructure, public services in the form of justice and safety, and by providing also high quality regulations. It also facilitates this process of Schumpeterian creative destruction, of renewal, and it does it by mitigating the disruption that this process can bring about. You talked about social protection. In fact, governments can provide social protection. It can also create an environment of labor market flexibility, and it can do retraining for those workers who have lost their jobs. This is what we call flex security, and it's copied by the Danish system of flex security that many countries are trying to encompass. Well, what I don't think is very appropriate, though, is for governments to intervene directly. The bar in that case for industrial policy should be very high. And I am doubtful that they can do it. In some cases, of course, there are externalities that could be addressed by governments. But we should always remember that there is lots of uncertainty surrounding industrial policies, that there is a room for corruption and state capture, and there are big fiscal costs. I come from Peru. In Spanish, we have this saying that goes something like "zapatero a tus zapatos." It really means shoemaker to your shoes. So everyone should do whatever is best, whatever they do best. Thanks.
But this creative destruction, creation is a very nice word, etc. But destruction, how to avoid that we end up in destruction with unemployment, stagnation, social turmoil. How can we think about that?
Yeah,
the flexicurity you mentioned, but
right. Yes, well, in the ideal world, creative destruction works this way. The unproductive firms get out, they release resources, and then productive firms take these resources, emerge, and grow. But that's not what happens in reality. In reality, whenever a shock occurs, then there is too much destruction of productive firms because they don't have access to financial services, because there are rigidities in the market, especially in labor markets, and then they have no other option but leaving the economy. There is also too little destruction of unproductive firms. large firms that are just protected under the pretext of too big to fail. Or we have just very small firms that governments somehow feel that they must be protected. And what we create is large and small zombies. Large zombies like in Japan, and small zombies like in Mexico and Sri Lanka. And sometimes today we have too little creation. These barriers of entry that are very important, that don't allow these firms to actually come into the economy. And also we have these large state-owned enterprises and sometimes advanced country industrial policy that prevents these firms from emerging. I really like what Indermit said in the WDR. It's this balance of forces of creation, preservation, and destruction. And it really reminds me of the Hindu religion that says that there are three main gods: Brahma, the creator; Vishnu, the preserver; and Shiva, the destroyer. And it is the balance between these three forces that brings order. And this order starts with good metrics and ends in evidence-based policies.
So Schumpeter was a Hinduist.
He probably was.
Yeah, Torbjörn Becker, you have, like in Development, also you do your research on a particular group of countries, in middle-income countries. But in countries that come from central command economies into varieties of free economies, and now on their way into the European Union, some of them, etc. Do you recognize the picture that we heard, or is that group of countries different in some way?
Well, you have to say they're different having looked at the chart. So let me just remind people here that may not be studying transition economics every day. This year is 35 years since this institute that I'm heading today was set up here at the Stockholm School. This was the year of the Berlin Wall coming down. This was the year of Solidarność in Poland, if you remember that. This was really the start of transition back then when we set up 35 years ago. And I have to say, the European Union got the Peace Prize and people were sort of a little bit making fun of that and so on. But it's really, really there when you look at these numbers, how important the European Union has been in the transformation of transition countries. So I was just teaching last week a group of PhD students about transition economics, and I showed them this chart also between the transition countries that actually are close geographically, higher income levels, but actually then also chose to become part of the European Union, and compare them with the transition countries that stayed out of the European Union. And it's quite obvious what an incredible difference that choice has made to these countries. I mean, it's not, we can discuss causality and who gets into the European Union and so on, but when you look at then the institutional development that has come with joining the European Union and what that has meant in terms of life expectancy, child mortality, democratic freedom, political freedom, all of these things that have been going hand in hand with economic development, and exactly then coming out of this middle income trap. So that having this, people sometimes call it external anchor for reforms for the European Union. And then other people say you cannot call it an anchor because that drags you down. So call it a lighthouse. But whatever you want to call it, I just think that the power of the EU in shaping the reforms and keeping these countries on the path to sort of modern market economies has been extremely important. And of course, geographic proximity has also then implied that they become included in the value chains of the more developed countries. People can migrate, bring ideas home, send remittances home, all of these things that really has created a dynamic environment in Europe. And I'm not going to go on much longer, but I also want to stress that there are a couple of transition countries that sort of were left out of this process, but has clearly indicated that they now want to join the European Union. And if you remember, the whole Maidan revolution in Kiev was called the Euromaidan exactly because people in Ukraine wanted to join the European Union. And this brings me just to one more, thought in this process is that we can also not, ignore the importance of security and stability in countries. And this, I think, for many of the other countries that we have been discussing, the security dimension and who is your ally and who is your, not so friendly neighbor country also plays an extremely important role in terms of who actually gets out of these poverty traps. If you're constantly interrupted by, fighting with a neighbor or being invaded or having coups and all of these things, you're not actually going to develop successfully economically. And I think, again, the transition countries are pretty prime examples of this as well. So I'll stop there.
So,
And maybe I should just say, I'm also here as the chair of EBA, so the expert group for aid studies. And I think there's been a lot of discussion about Sweden now turning towards supporting the countries in our neighborhood that wants to join the European Union. And of course, as the expert group, when this process has been going on for a while, we are also going to look into how this process has worked and do the regular evaluation of Swedish aid to different countries in this sort of new context that we see today.
but the billion-dollar question that comes from what you describe is whether there might be or is any lighthouse or anchor for the other middle-income countries outside of this group.
Well, I think, can I just add 2 seconds on it? I think it's important that when we're focusing now on our own neighborhood, that we don't forget the other countries. We actually try to be that lighthouse maybe for a wider set of countries than just our closest neighbor. And that goes, of course, for other important countries in the region. But we cannot let countries like Russia continue to influence sort of their neighborhood in the way they have done in the past. That has been a disaster for many of the countries in their neighborhood. So we really need to be able to provide an alternative to the autocratic forces that want to become, really an anchor to keep countries down.
Thank you. Hai Shan-Fu, I think I won't offend anyone else within this team coming from the World Bank, but perhaps you're the most welcome person to Sweden. Because chief statistician, we love statistics here in this country. We set out in 1756 to create the first statistical agency in the world, Tabellverket. Its successor is still around because data is needed to read a society, to be able to read a society, to understand economies and to take the good decisions. So let's talk about data in these middle-income countries. Do these countries and organizations supporting them have the right data at the right time? What would you say?
Thank you for that question, even though it comes in last, but in my mind, it's one of the most important. So that's why over the weekend, I did shoot an email to Shamik, who is the director of this report. Given the weightiness of this discussion, I asked him where did he find the most challenge when it comes to the empirical basis for the analysis, because we need the credibility, we need the real potential policy advice that can generate a real change. So this is what he responded to me. He said the biggest impediment was access to data, for example, on firm growth and value added. We have very little information as economic census are hard to find, and many firm surveys are not accessible. Tax records and custom records can provide supplementary information, but not a real substitute for good firm level data. He also said, second, we don't have good data on social economic mobility, especially over time in those developing countries. We use proxies of education attainment, but they are limited in its use. Data on allocation of talent is also hard to come by. So you could see not only the importance of such data, but also the limitations of the world we're facing. So what he's telling me is really a reflection of the reality that in many developing countries, low income and middle income, it's amazing that for a big part of the world, we have been rapidly entering into AI age, but those countries, many of them continue to remain on the wrong side of the data divide and risking being left out to be on the also the wrong side of the AI divide, because many of them still don't have the capacity to produce some of the most critical data. They are also lacking the capacity to leverage the new sources of data, and also might not have the right institution and legal arrangement to enable such critical, innovative use of data from different sources. As a data person, I just want to give you a few data points of this data landscape many of those countries are facing. Some of those facts are really, startling. Because right now, we still have only 22% of low middle income countries and slightly over half of the upper middle income countries can have a real functioning civil registration system, giving a credible count of population in those economies. And also less than 10% of lower middle income countries and less than 20% of upper middle income countries have direct access to cloud computing facilities. Maybe in the last few years, there has been some change, but the basic picture has not changed. At the same time, less than 20% of upper middle income countries, around 10% lower middle income countries, only those have established some form of data governance entities that will allow them to begin to explore how to really make access and use of those new data sources and supporting the sharing and cross-border flow of those data that will enable us not only to understand the dynamics of the development reality, but also to formulate sensible policy options for them. We all know that the relationship between income, a positive relationship between income and level of development with the data availability and data quality. But is that really given fate for those middle income countries? That's the question I'm asking. Because are we waiting for more growth, more development in order to have more data? Or at this age and time, when digital economy and data economy and AI technology would offer perhaps a different development path and different pace of development, is where we need to prioritize the investment in this overall data this infrastructure and data capacity, so that we really have the right information to inform not public policy making, but really providing the real new power line and new infrastructure for development. Perhaps the middle income country now face slightly different development possibilities than the examples you gave, because the technology of this world has really enabled us to do different things, even though we also have to manage the risks. So that's why the World Development Report 2021, Data for Better Lives, put forward this new vision of us investing in countries through their digital infrastructure and the right to data governance, so that we can foster integrated national data systems. So not only data provided by or generated by the national government statistical system will be of more higher quality and more accessible and more timely, but also we can make use and integrate those data with those are increasingly in the hands of private sector, generated by the business processes and so on and so forth. So this is the challenge.
Great challenges. Yeah. Going back to the story in Dermot and perhaps Norman, if I understood correctly, a middle income country moving from lower to upper and graduating need to shift their strategy. They need to do things differently. So we're not talking about linear evolution here. We're talking about steps and jumps, etc. Do we have indicators that capture such? Can we know when they're doing the right thing? Do we have indicators for that? Norman, you produce a lot of reports and indicators at the World Bank. Do you have the right indicators?
That question, if we have the right indicators, is a good one. But I will refer to your first question.
Okay.
Whether we have some indicators and whether they are relevant. I hope that we also produce data and indicators. So I hope that I can join Haishan's group of the most welcome people here in Stockholm.
Absolutely.
So we are the Global Indicators Group. This is a little brochure that shows the 4 projects that we have. You might know some of them. Business Ready is the one that replaces the famous Doing Business. Enterprise Surveys, which has been expanded exponentially now to cover 180 economies in a 3-year cycle. We produce Subnational Business Ready, which is for within country studies, and we produce Women, Business and the Law. I have some executive summary here of the latest report, and I have some more if you are interested. So I agree completely with Haishan that data analysis and research are the foundations of policy advocacy and policy reform. If you allow me the geographic analogy, they are like a map and a compass. They allow you to see where you are exactly in relation to where you want to get. And it also tells you exactly what route to take. And this is what you were saying in terms of different steps for different economies. We have identified 3 major gaps, and we have linked each of our indicators to these gaps. And this may be to the question of relevance that you asked. The first gap is a jobs gap. The second is a gender gap. And the third is a geospatial gap. The jobs gap is massive. There is an ever-increasing supply of labor around the world. Let me tell you that by 2050 in Africa, there will be 2 billion people. That is, the number of people would have increased by 100%, where the majority of those people will actually be in a working age. If there are no jobs for them, there will be very few things for them to do. One of them is to migrate. The other is to work in the informal sector. The other will be to be unemployed, or even worse, to have a life of criminality and conflict. The assessment that we have as to how we can increase jobs and close that gap is business ready. That is, having the private sector sufficiently capable of producing the jobs that you need. And enterprise surveys, it goes in the same direction. For the gender gap, the issue is that women have only 2 rights, 2/3 of the rights of men. And whereas men work about 75%, that is the labor force participation of men is 75%, for women it's only 50%. And this is on average. For some countries, say India, it's only 30%. So because of this huge gap, we created Women, Business and the Law, which allows you to tell what the women's right for economic empowerment are. And finally, the geospatial gap. The main issue here is that you have a big divide between rural areas and urban areas, and between urban areas across different cities. For that, we created the Subnational Business Ready. Lord Kelvin is famous for saying, if you cannot measure, you cannot improve it. So indicators for improving the world.
Thank you. We promised a Q&A session. That's the time now. You have sent your questions to Maria here. We'll read them out. But before that, I will, or is it that you move around with the mic? You read them out. Before that, I will ask an impossible question to the whole panel, because I have this problem with the model that you start out in a situation A, the lower middle income, where your approach is to imitate, emulate, even piracy might be a possible way, frugal innovation. You work with what you got. And then to move onwards, you need a situation where you have a proper innovation system, proper intellectual property rights. To have intellectual property rights system that works, you need a legal system that works. To have a legal system that works, yeah, etc. We're right into governance issues. And how can we think about this? Should I continue to be worried about this shift over from situation A to situation B? How can we think about it, that move? You get recommendations, but can you sort of boil them down to this shift? Would that be possible?
It would be, but I'll have to give you a very long answer and you'll cut me
And
off.
I'll cut you off. All right. So we agree on that one. Yeah. So there's no one-liner on that one. Is it a problem, the one I described?
No, it is a problem. And if you leave until later the foundations of, let's say, good innovation systems and so on, if you leave until later, you find you get stuck then because you don't have these things, you know? Just as if you, let's say, for example, you say during the investment phase that you leave until later openness to trade and things like that, you will get stuck again, you know? So that's one. But I quickly want to think, you know, we often do have the information and we sometimes use the wrong information. So for example, when it comes to, because we're lazy, not because of any other reason. So for example, we look at these superficial characteristics of enterprises. Small is good, big is bad. Wrong. High value added is good, low value added is bad. The second one is, if you look, for example, at high inequality is bad, low inequality is good. Not necessarily the case. Right? Sometimes you can have too low inequality because on the incentive side. And so on. However, if you look at things like socioeconomic mobility, higher socioeconomic mobility is always better. Okay. Now, the next part is that, you know, we tend to focus a lot on the sources of energy. We say we want more on the renewables, right? But what we really want is to use the energy that we have well, efficiently. When you end up doing something like that, renewables, you end up getting into the kind of mess that the EU's definition of renewables has. So if you import wood pellets from North Carolina, that's supposed to be a good thing. Why is that a good thing? You know, if you're importing wood pellets from another continent, if you're then burning it and emitting more than you would if you use gas, why is that a good thing? See? So because of that reason, we have to use that right indicator.
Thanks. Elina.
Can I just jump in on that discussion? Because I like the question about the role of good governance and building institutions. That is pretty much the bread and butter of what development institutions do. And if you do it properly at the early stages of the development, you get the payoff as you go along. And it's equally important to get the basics right, even at the later stages. What we are not as good at is showing the importance of that and measuring the impact of institutional changes in terms of increased investments, in terms of increasing economic development. So I think there's indicator work and accountability indicators to be developed there. But indeed, I subscribe to your analysis of the importance of laying the land correctly and strengthen the legal systems that then enables the growth process to happen and leapfrog to the next level.
Let's see, Maria, if there are questions from
yes,
the audience, please.
Yeah, I can get the mic. So there were several questions on the theme of the green transition, of course. And one direct question to Indermit was about why don't you think that the type of energy matters? But I think you just answered to that. More in general, the questions are about how do we generate growth without causing environmental damage? There are also questions that solicit a little bit more details about a policy that countries could do. For example, what type of economic policy that Singapore got right, other middle-income countries have been missing out on? What are the harmful trade policies that you mentioned? What about industrial policy that seems to be in vogue? What should we think about this? So in general, about more policies that countries could adopt. middle-income countries. Should I?
Maybe we stop there and see if there are comments from the panel. Who'd like to take this on? Much on the policy side. What policies?
On the trade policies, by the way, the biggest culprits are the G20 countries. They tend to, these are the large economies. And the biggest victims are the small economies. And it doesn't matter whether they're rich or poor and so on. Small economies really do need trade, and big economies can do without it, even though they also do better with trade. So right now, I would say it's very easy to tell who are the culprits and who are the victims.
And then we understand what kind of policies are good and bad following that analysis. I think Norman wants to chip in here.
So on the issue of policies and regulations, I think that there is a very large space for high quality regulations that are targeted to the nature of the economy where they are going to be enacted. So there is really no need to have a single rule for everyone to follow. We should take into account the level of development. Let me give you an example. If you try to impose the labor market regulations that you have in Switzerland on countries like Nigeria, Brazil, or Cambodia, what you are going to get is unemployment or a very large informal sector, which you already have. So you need to really think about the skills. You really need to think about the size of the labor force, the business demands before you enact these regulations. But that doesn't mean that regulations are not important. They are, of course, important. And institutions are even more important because they are like the brains that elaborate those country-specific policies.
So we need to adjust and things need to go together.
Yes.
As well. Elina, you wanted to come in?
Yeah, if I just may, because I mean, these are exactly the topics that we're discussing at the moment. Just earlier today, we had a debate at Sida about trade policies based on EBA's report. I would recommend for everybody to read on the current state of affairs, what we know about trade policies and their impact on economic development. I think that the recent developments are very much tied also to the question of green transition, because a lot of the trade barriers that have been enacted in the name of green transition. But I think there is a legitimate case to make sure that the countries that we are most concerned about have the capacity to actually comply. It's not just setting up new barriers in the name of the greater good. The aim is to create a more sustainable growth path for everybody to go to follow. And the ambition of the Swedish government is to have the trade policy and development policy go closer together. And one of the discussion topics today was that, well, maybe there's more to do on the trade policy side to actually make that happen and to make sure that the countries that are developing have the space and opportunity to do so.
Well, you hit
You
hit the nail on the head, because when you talk to middle-income economies, we hear from them over and over again that a lot of the environmentalism is being used as protection. Okay, so in fact, for example, the classic case, of course, is China, where you have a lot of green intermediates. And if you really cared only about the environment, at least over the next 10 years or so, at least for the countries who actually have near-term goals of net zero, then you would not be trying to dissuade countries from importing these green intermediates from China. So in fact, there are clear, clear smoking guns, quote unquote, that actually say that in fact, a lot of this protectionism is using environmentalism as a guise. But the real problem is competitiveness in these countries. And rather than improve competitiveness through structural reforms and so on in these countries, instead, what's being done is to use environmentalism. Hypocrisy is a lousy basis of making policy. It's a lousy basis.
Aishan.
Yeah, no, I just want to respond to the question of how to generate growth without damaging environment. I don't have a policy prescription, but I happen to have brought a book. Actually, it's a present I'm giving to a prominent economist, but I brought it here. It's called Development Economics by a very dear former colleague and friend, Kate Raworth, who was named one of the 5 female economists who are redefining everything. Because this book fundamentally questions the model we all learn in Economics 101. You remember the supply and demand and rational thinking and so on and so forth. Well, environmental changes are being considered as externality rather than part and parcel of growth. So this is why the donut economics urge us to think, well, the inner circle is the social floors, the basic human dignity and social needs need to be met. We have to think about the planetary boundaries and the impact on the environment and develop our economic models and policy options accordingly. I strongly urge everyone to read this.
So thanks for this commercial.
It's not, it contains real.
I think there are more questions, Maria.
There are more questions if there is more time.
Yeah, we have a little more time, yeah.
Yeah, so maybe a couple of questions about development cooperation. So maybe to Elina, but really to anyone who wants to answer. It's hard for bilateral, multilateral organization to boost growth directly, middle-income countries. So how can they work in these countries? Are there public goods or structures that they can provide to act as enablers for growth? Also, another question with a focus on partnerships to support research capacity and innovation that Sweden has been big on, supporting many lower income countries to develop research. What's the role for this? Should these cooperations be prioritized? And then there are some questions about inequality, the importance of social protection. Should we try to focus on equality earlier in a country's development to avoid later on social gaps?
Okay, let's do like this. We are about to round up with the question of development cooperation or cooperation here from the World Bank, from bilateral donors or partners. What could you, each of you, say a few words on that topic? And we round up with that. Torbjörn, would you be able to start? Or?
I think my EBA hat tells me that I should be listening to them and then have the evaluation at the end.
All right. So we start. And since you're my boss at the EBA, we start with you and Dermot.
Oh, really? Okay. So I think the first one is what can Sweden do to help? I think I'll try to answer that. So the first one is, so for low income countries, I think it is extreme poverty and it should continue to remain that. The real question is, how do you do extreme poverty? And so I'll just give you one statistic. If you look at the amount of spending on education per pupil per year in a low income country, it is $50. Okay, that is 0.5% of that of a rich country like Sweden. 0.5. Now, if you say, oh, obviously that means that we should want these countries to spend more on education. Well, we also want them to spend more on a whole lot of other things then. He said, oh, you must spend on social welfare too. You must do this. You must raise taxes and you must try to do all of this stuff. It is a mission impossible to actually do that. When it comes to what Sweden can do with middle-income countries, knowledge transfers.
Okay, thank you. Elina.
Thank you. And I think the question was well put. The role of the development cooperation agencies is not to do growth in the countries. We're way too small for that. It's negligible compared to the country's own resources. We are there, and our mission is to create preconditions for that growth to happen. And that's where all the good governance, institutional building, human capacity that we have been talking about today come in. So I think that is the right role for us. When it comes to the research support, it is not my role or intention to assess or dictate the government policy on where the development cooperation support should be allocated. I'm just making a note that Sweden has been a very long-term partner building research capacity in our in our partner countries. And the reason why our distinguished guests are here today is that we have been supporting the Knowledge for Change program at the World Bank, creating the knowledge base for decades. And this is one of the results of that, of use of the Swedish taxpayer money for that.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Norman.
I will answer or try to answer the second question, the one on inequality. So if we have this very simple paradigm of poor and rich economies, and we have two priorities, growth and reducing inequality, I think that for poor countries, the priority is growth. The second priority, reducing inequality. As the country increases in its income, then the priority is reducing inequality, and the second one is growth. If we try to go with the goal of reducing inequality when the country is very poor, the only thing that we achieve is redistributing poverty. When we actually shift that goal and the country is richer, then we redistribute wealth, which is what we want to get.
Thank you. Harshan.
Yeah, to have the right data at the right time for us to define our real future, we must scale up investment in country data systems. This is why Bank renewed our mission to eradicate poverty on labor planet, also embarked on a new roadmap, and at the same time committed to become a stronger data bank. That precisely meant that we want to help country to generate the right data at the source, but also promote their innovative use to inform policy and development. At the same time, it's also about fostering real partnership with private sectors to learn how we can really introduce the right to data governance, at the same time to use the data generated by them through their business processes and integrate them to generate the real actionable insight in countries and also inform global development. So that's why I think all the donors, please, we're going through IDA replenishment, and we're also trying to set up really facility to support collective innovation, because we're at the time, the old approaches might no longer work. We need to really innovate together.
Torbjörn, the evaluation of these four then.
Well, I think it's actually a nice opportunity to summarize the importance of knowledge and research and capacity building. I would stress one particular element of this, which is to build local capacity for doing research and education. And this is actually something, of course, that the Swedish government has been involved. We are involved in our region. We have a network of sister institutions in Eastern Europe. And I just think that we have to make sure that people in these countries can make these informed decisions themselves, so that we as sort of experts don't come and tell them you should do this or that. They should have the capacity to do this analysis themselves, maybe with our help and maybe in collaboration with us and maybe with funding from us. But the fact that they have this capacity in their own countries, I think is fundamental for these.
So to everyone